I think it's massively deepened my appreciation for Jesus. Just as I see how far short I fall, it really was painful for him to not give in to Satan in the wilderness. I would give in a heartbeat. It was just so painful for him in the Garden of Gethsemane to, be wrestling with God. If this is really your will, is there another way? And then to think about him hanging on the cross, and people just mocking him and asking him to come down from the cross. And any of us would have come down from the cross. We would have just given in there and then, but he doesn't. And so that just really makes me rejoice and be thankful for him.
How do you effectively teach Old Testament narrative in a way which brings it to life for a congregation? In today's episode, we sat down with Denesh Divyanathan, senior pastor of the Crossing Church in Singapore. Following a career in financial journalism, Denesh trained for ministry in Sydney and Illinois before returning to Singapore to plant the Crossing Church.
Denesh has recently been preaching through the book of Judges, and we sat down with him today to ask him about his first sermon in this series on Judges chapter 1, as well as about the book of Judges as a whole, and how Christians might be drawn into compromising on their walk with the Lord, much the same way that ancient Israel did. This sermon can be listened to wherever you listen to the Bible Matters podcast. My name's Leo Elborn.
And my name's Tiff Stromso, and this is the Bible Matters podcast, encouraging faithful Bible teaching and ministry. Denesh Divyanathan, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
When did you first become convicted that we need to preach the whole of the Bible, even difficult books like Judges?
Well, I think it goes back probably to just early days when I was a Christian, really. And as I was taught the Bible, I was really fortunate to be taught it really well. And people helped me to see that the Bible was one story fulfilled in Jesus. I was an undergraduate student in the 90s, which sounds like a long time ago now. And the kind of big book, I guess, that people were saying that I ought to read as a student was a book called Gospel and Kingdom by Graham Goldsworthy. That's kind of like the precursor to God's Big Picture, I guess, by Vaughan, which is now really popular. So I think that was a really, really helpful book that just helped me to see how the whole Bible was one story. I did a Bible overview course as an undergraduate. That was just super helpful to just see just everything from Genesis to Revelation fulfilled in Jesus. So I guess I was convicted as a Bible reader, as a Christian, that the whole Bible story is about Jesus. And therefore, I thought if I ever had the privilege to be a Bible teacher, that's what I want to do.
So we're going to be talking today a little bit about a series you've preached in the book of Judges for your church in Singapore, The Crossing. Before we jump into Judges, can you just tell us a little bit about who you were preaching to as you delivered these talks?
Yeah, absolutely. So my home church in Singapore is called The Crossing Church. And we're a church that began about 14 years ago in my living room. We were pretty tiny back then. We were 16 adults, and all three of my bedrooms were the Sunday school rooms. It's pretty chaotic.
That's a very, very easy commute to work for you, though.
Indeed. And, that was 14 years ago. And by God's grace, we've grown. We're about 1,200, 1,300 adults now on a Sunday. So Sundays are quite busy now. We're spread over 5 English congregations and 1 Mandarin.
And just to check, do you still meet in your living room?
No, unfortunately not. I wish the property had grown, along with the size of the congregation, but not quite. So these sermons in Judges are sermons that we've preached to the 5 English congregations on a Sunday. And I guess our congregation is fairly young. I would say about 70% are 40 and under. 30% would be above 40 years old, and really the bulk of that would be 40s and 50s. Not that many in their 60s and 70s. By and large, we're university educated professionals, lots of lawyers, bankers, civil servants. We're quite middle class. So that's really the kind of context. I guess if you think city centre church in the UK, university town kind of church, we would be very, very similar.
And can I ask then, why did you want to preach on Judges for the Crossing Church at this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Every year we try and preach through some of the main genres. So we always preach a gospel, we always preach an epistle, we always preach an Old Testament book. And at the start of each year, or rather before the start of each year, as the elders, we sit down and we try and ask ourselves what we should teach the church next year, both in small groups and in the pulpit. And the main thing we're trying to ask ourselves is, what do we think we need to hear as a church from God at this point in our history? And to kind of dig into that a little bit, we ask ourselves, are there weaknesses in our church that need addressing? Are there strengths in our church that would be good to kind of fan into flames at this point? And then how can our teaching program, whether in small groups or in the pulpit, really serve that? So that's the big question we begin with. And then I guess when looking at Old Testament books, we thought Judges would be a really, really good book for us for two big reasons. One is I think it kind of gives us a deep dive into the human condition and just how ingrained sin is. We thought that would be really helpful for us to ponder about and to kind of just have that stare at us chapter after chapter for our whole series. But at the same time, we thought the other thing would be really helpful would be just to lift our eyes to see the grace of God, His faithfulness to us as His people, despite how weak and how sinful we are. As a Singaporeans, I don't know if you know much about Singaporeans. Singaporeans are very industrious people. They're very, they're a hive of activity all the time. And they're people that generally work very hard. We're very self-dependent in lots of ways. And I guess our church is quite similar. We're very busy. We've always got a lot of things happening, new plans. And there's a tendency, I guess, a danger that we could be trusting in our own strength and thinking that, we can do it if we put our mind to it. So we thought a book like Judges would really confront that and help us to see the human condition, but at the same time help us to hopefully gaze and marvel at God's grace and God's faithfulness.
Let's dive into Judges. Can you tell us a bit more about the book? What was your understanding of the book before you came to study it for this sermon series?
Yeah, I've never actually preached it before. Never sat in a Bible study for Judges before, really. So I knew basically two big things about Judges before the actual prep for the sermon series began. And one was, I guess, people know that there's this cycle in Judges that's quite well known. So the people of Israel sin, and then after that, God punishes them by giving them to the hands of a foreign nation. They cry out for despair. God raises the judges to save them. There's peace, rest for a while, then they sin again. So there's this cycle, and I was aware that there was this cycle that was there. I wasn't quite really aware about, why this point of repeated cycles. Was there any progress in it? But I was aware there were these cycles. And then I was also aware towards the end of the book, that great refrain about Israel having no king and everyone doing as they saw fit. And so those two things were pretty clear in my mind. And I guess before I studied it seriously, the big thing that came out to me was that it was a book all about sin. And so just quite negative, I guess, was my view of the book before I studied it in detail.
And I guess after spending some time studying it, and especially after preaching it, how has that changed? Have you seen any kind of answers to those questions that you had? Is there progression in the repetitions? Is it more than just sin? How's your understanding changed?
Yeah, I think it's developed in a number of ways. I'll mention just maybe three of those.
Okay.
I think the first thing I saw was that it wasn't just cycles, but there was this downward spiral, which made it worse, really. So each generation getting worse than the one before. And that was quite obvious as you looked at how the book progressed. But that was true of the judges as well. So you began with the first judge, Othniel. He seemed to be, your poster boy, quite a perfect character, really. Doesn't seem to have any blemish, spirit empowered. And then as the judges kind of progressed, you realize that they became more and more sinful in a way. And Samson, the last of them, he looks just like the people. So he's kind of like, gone all the way down. And then I guess as the book as a whole it kind of, again, the people become more and more like the people of the land. And towards the end of the book, they look just like the people of Sodom, committing very, very similar acts. So to just kind of see that downward spiral, I think was quite interesting as a progression. I think the second thing that I probably didn't realize until studying the book in detail was to just see God's grace, how he just persisted with these sinful people again and again and again, how he kept raising judges for them. And even, just a simple thing like in the early book of Judges, when they cry out to the Lord, I've always just assumed that was them crying out in repentance. But actually, studying it more, I realized that phrase crying out was not a cry of repentance. It was more a cry of just despair, really, the people in desperation. And so God hears not the repentant cry, but just a despairing cry of his people. But he's so compassionate. He raises judges for them. So I think that grace of God, his faithfulness to his people and his covenant, I think that was something that was quite new to me and surprising, and really kind of came to the fore. I think the third thing was just looking at the different judges and seeing them as patterns of salvation. So I guess a judge is just a savior. And to just see that in little ways, they kind of give us little pictures of how God saves his people, which ultimately I guess we would see fulfilled in Jesus. So I think that was quite illuminating. So, Othniel, spirit empowered, you see that in Jesus. Ehud was this weak looking guy. He's left-handed in the time where people were right-handed in the army. He's a Benjamite, doesn't seem to come from a significant tribe. And then Jesus, he's weak looking, comes from Nazareth, seemingly insignificant again. Samson saves the nation by dying, a bit of a pattern of Jesus. So yeah, just seeing that I think was very, very helpful.
It's cool that you bring up God's grace. And actually, it was one of the things that struck me from your talks, that actually this book, which I think is really well known for being quite dark, does actually have these awesome examples of God's grace. And we'll talk a bit about that later. It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert in Judges. I think, like you said, the thing I knew before listening to your series was this spiral of descent. But I do also remember listening to the story of Ehud when I was a kid. I mean, a kid's like thoroughly uninterested in the Bible. And all of a sudden you've got this story of a guy who goes to the villain and says, what is it? He says something like, I've got a message for you. Or he goes, I have a message from God for you. Exactly. Pulls out his sword and stabs him. And I was like, oh, wow. This book was not what I thought it was.
Exactly. And all the gory details of after the stabbing. I mean, our youth group sits into the sermons. They loved it.
Oh, wow.
Especially so the boys, I think.
Yeah. Just those two verses. There is so much that you would not expect to find in the Bible.
Exactly. Yeah.
Dinesh, as I listened to your talks, one of the things that jumped out to me, I think it was in the first talk, was you talked a little bit about the Old Testament context. You kind of drew links to Exodus and Joshua and things that have happened in those books, which are repeating or seem to be repeating in Judges. I thought I was particularly struck in the first talk by this really interesting theme that Israel themselves take slaves, which God didn't command for them to do. And in doing so, they become like Egypt. And I was like, whoa. That's really quite significant. But I did just want to ask you, how much does knowing the biblical context help you in your understanding of the book of Judges?
I guess in summary, I would say that it probably doesn't change the meaning, but it probably adds depth. So I think that point, for example, that you mentioned about Israel taking forced labor, already, I think just in the plain reading of the text sounds quite negative. And I think if we know a little bit of the context of Deuteronomy, for example, then we would know that that's what they were not supposed to do. So that kind of adds a little bit of depth to it. I think if we understand the story from Exodus, then we see that, that's exactly what Egypt did to them. I think that adds a little bit more severity to what's happening. So I don't think it necessarily changes the meaning as such. I guess just thinking of off the top of my head, another kind of example would be, you kind of see already in the early chapters of Judges, that the people are turning their backs from God, and that looks horrendous. But if we know a bit of the background of Israel, then actually adds depth to it. So Exodus 19, God actually wants Israel to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, people belonging to God. And actually, by the time you come to Judges 2, there are people who don't know God and the work that he's done for them. By the end of the book, they're like Sodom, really. So knowing that doesn't change the meaning, but it adds depth to what was seen. But I guess one big question you want to be doing will be to ask yourself, actually, where are we in the Bible story? And significantly, what's come before and what's coming after? And especially what's come before, how does that feed into the understanding of where we are? So you don't just want to read Judges in isolation, for example.
Okay, so Denesh, in a nutshell, what is Judges about?
Yeah, I guess if you put a few of those things I've been saying together, it's this picture of the damning, persistent sin of the people. It's a picture of the amazing grace of God to save these people through the Judges. There's this refrain at the end: they had no king. They did what was right in their own eyes. Well, I think all that kind of pushes us, at least as a team, to think that the big kind of purpose of Judges was to repent of our sin and look to God's king to bring rest. So obviously being confronted by Israel's sin, I think that has to push us to kind of own that and turn from it. The kind of refrain at the end about the king, I think, is probably trying to push you to see what a mess when you have no king. No king that can lead you to do what's right in God's eyes. So you're looking to God's king, and that rest idea, I guess, is all the way through Judges, and you want the king to bring God's rest. I guess secondarily, as a team of preachers, where we are at the Crossing, we thought that actually the book also wanted us to marvel at God's gracious covenant love for his people, because you just see that all the way through, him persisting with his people. So we wanted that to come true as well.
And Denesh, why do you think Christians in particular need to know those truths?
Yeah, that's a great question. The reformer, John Calvin, he talked about how true knowledge or true wisdom, it requires kind of a double knowledge. On the one hand, a knowledge of God, and on the other hand, a knowledge of ourselves. And I guess what Judges does is it reframes our knowledge of God, and it challenges our knowledge of ourselves. So it reframes our knowledge of God. As you kind of wade through this book, you see him as patient, as gracious. He's long-suffering, he's compassionate, he persists with his wayward people. I think that faithful God just really gets magnified in the book. So our knowledge of God is reframed in that way positively. And I guess it challenges our knowledge of ourselves to kind of just see we're more sinful and, I guess, hell-bent on disobedience, idolatry, than we might even think of ourselves. I think that's really, really very confronting. I'll tell you a little story. My daughter is 12 years old. She's the youngest of three kids, and she sits into the sermons. And one day at dinner, as we were preaching through Judges, Sunday evening for dinner, we always ask the kids, what did you take away for yourself from the sermon? It used to be that they'll just give sermon feedback, but these days we say, no, what do you take away from the sermon for yourself? And my daughter said, why is Israel so stupid? Why do they keep making this same mistake again and again? To which my two sons almost kind of replied in unison, isn't that just like us? Which is quite helpful. And I said, yeah, that's exactly the point, isn't it? It's a bit like a mirror to ourselves and our own sinful, idolatrous hearts. So yeah, just a great book, I think, just to be reframed in the knowledge of God, challenged in our knowledge of ourselves.
Quite a hard message, but I guess we need it.
We're going to be looking at this first talk of yours from this series, chapter 1, verse 1 through to chapter 2, verse 5. Denesh, it was a long passage. I think I was on my bike when I was listening to the reading. how have you decided what your passages are going to be, how you would break them up as you preach through the book of Judges?
Yeah, I think we generally try to look for the preaching units in the books that we're preaching. So I guess when we were doing our prep for Judges, we tried to just find where the natural section divisions were. So I guess for the book of Judges, you have kind of a double introduction at the start and a double conclusion at the end. And then essentially through the rest of the book, it basically just follows the story of each of the 12 judges, and then Abimelech, who's like the anti-judge. So I guess for us, we just tried to stick within those preaching units because it seems like, the author had set up the book in that way. And therefore, we thought the best way to be teaching the book would be to just try and follow his lead in terms of the sections that he was giving us. Some of them are too long. I think the later ones, like, Gideon's quite a long story, Samson's quite a long story. So we broke that into a few sermons. But for this first sermon, we could have gone from chapter 1, verse 1, I guess, all the way to chapter 3, verse 6. So that would have been the whole introduction before the second sermon does the first couple of Judges.
When you say double introduction, forgive my ignorance, but what are you referring to there?
Yeah, so chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 5 is like an introduction part 1. And then chapter 2, verse 6 to chapter 3, verse 6 is like an introduction part 2. And you can kind of see a clue of this. So like chapter 1, verse 1 says after the death of Joshua, and then you have all your narrative. And then chapter 2, verse 6 says when Joshua dismissed the people. And you're kind of thinking, well, that's kind of weird. Like you began the book, verse 1, telling me he had died. And then now
He's
you
back
come
from
back.
the dead.
Exactly. So what's happened? So you realize that the chronology has been kind of played with a little bit. So then I guess you're asking yourself, what's going on there? And I guess for us, chapter 1, verse 1 to 2, 5 was kind of painting the picture of a progressive deterioration after Joshua's death. And in a way, less of the spiritual issues highlighted, more of the moral issue of them, having forced, subjecting the people to forced labor, for example. But then in the second introduction, chapter 2, verse 6 to 3, verse 6, I think that zooms in more on the spiritual issue. For example, chapter 2, verse 10, we're told that this is another generation that rose. They didn't know the Lord or the work that he had done from Israel. Chapter 2, verse 11 onwards, we see that Israel did was evil in the sight of the Lord. They began to serve the Baals. They went after other gods. They bowed down to them. So that spiritual dimension is highlighted in the second introduction. And that's kind of reversed at the end of the book, where you have one conclusion, it seems, and that's about a spiritual decline. And then right at the end of the book, you have that moral mess and chaos.
Dinesh, just to take a little step back for a moment, can you just take us to your study? What does it look like for you to sit down and prepare to write any talk?
Yeah, it actually is kind of a 4-step process. So I have a habit of doing quiet times on the book that we're going to preach about 3 to 6 months in advance.
When you say quiet time, do you just mean reading it yourself?
Yeah, just reading it for myself. Yeah, so for my own Bible devotions each day. And so I found that really helpful over the years because I can have a rough idea of the lay of the land of a book. I get a feel for it. So I would have read Judges 3 to 6 months ago and just made my own observations and allowed the book really to speak to me, which is quite helpful. And to get a real feel for the book myself. So that's kind of an advanced prep. And I will already begin by then to try and figure out where I think the preaching units are likely to be. So that's the first thing I do. And then we're quite privileged, I guess. We have a team of preachers at our church, and we have a preacher's breakfast every Monday morning at 8 a.m., 8 to 9 a.m. And we meet 3 weeks in advance of the sermon you're about to preach. So quite a lot in advance. And if you're preaching that week, you'll come and present what you think, is the main point, the purpose of the passage you're going to preach, the sections, how you're going to apply it. And then the preachers will help you, your fellow preachers, and grill you, challenge you, I guess, to just sharpen you. So that's kind of step 2.
So that's not a complete sermon. That's kind of an outline, your main points, where you're going to go with it. Exactly.
Yeah. And they're really good because they're all, all of us are trying to preach this book together as a team. And obviously they would help to sharpen your application based on our understanding of the congregation and so on and so forth. So that's step 2. And then I guess the third step is after that preacher's breakfast, I then sit down on Tuesday, Wednesday, which are my sermon prep days. And that's where I do a little bit more study, maybe from some questions raised. And then I actually write the sermon. So I write it word for word. And then the last thing is that I actually try to finish my sermons 1 week in advance. So if I'm preaching next Sunday, I will finish it this Wednesday. And then I won't look at it again until next Friday.
Wow. Why do you do that?
Why do I do that? Yeah. I found that really helpful over the years because it basically means I haven't looked at the sermon script for about 10 days. And when I look at it again, I just ask myself, oh my gosh, you're so convoluted, Denesh. Like all these really confusing things and this illustration doesn't work. And, you could be much sharper with this or that. So it's really just helped with clarity. And I find that, it's kind of like a school essay, right? When you're rushing for the deadline and you're trying to edit, your editing is not going to be very good. But when you've had some time away and then you come back, I think you look at it with fresh eyes. So that's kind of my 4-step process, I guess.
Although I guess at that point, you're slightly scuppered if you realize it's total trash.
You have Friday, brother. You have Friday.
Denesh, you mentioned a Bible reading tip is to look for repetitions. I think you mentioned the phrase "did not drive out." You really helpfully took us through that. Why is that a helpful thing to do? And why do Bible writers use it so much?
I think just to notice, I guess, what the authors are putting there as clues. So I guess it's easy to kind of think the Bible writers are trying to make things obscure or complicated or complex, but actually not really. And I guess they're just certain tools that they use to try and highlight to us what the passage is about. And I guess repetition is one very, very common one used throughout the Bible. And so if we spot it, then I think that's the author trying to put something in bold or highlights to say, pay attention here. Like, this is the main thing. This is the main thing. I guess there are other tools. I mean, sometimes it's a surprise in the text, like you didn't expect things to go in this particular way, but that surprise, I think, is actually the key that the author wants you to grasp hold of. Sometimes it's an authorial comment. I was, just preaching recently on Abimelech and trying to make sense of it, end of chapter 8 and the whole of chapter 9. And just going, what on earth is this about? And why have this anti-judge figure? I mean, everyone's been a judge raised up by God, and then you have Abimelech. But right at the end of the narrative, so helpful, chapter 9, verse 56, 57, basically is the author's comment about how God returns the evil of Abimelech and the people of Shechem. So I guess just trying to pick up what clues the author has put in there to highlight to me that this is the main thing to pay attention to.
We're simple creatures, aren't we? We need to hear things multiple times before they go in. I think about how many times I may have heard, I heard the reading, but actually it was only when you started saying it in the sermon that I was like, oh yes, it does say did not drive out quite a lot. Which is something actually you emphasized in your sermon, is you were actually pointing out repetition. You could have just said, this phrase is repeated a lot. Why did you want to give your congregation that kind of a tip? You are the Bible teacher. So why did you decide to do that?
Yeah, I don't always do that. I guess in the main, we're just trying to be modeling faithful Bible teaching as much as we can. But I guess when a tool is there, it's quite obvious. There's time in the sermon to do it. Then I think that's a really helpful thing to just teach the congregation how to read their Bibles more faithfully. So I do that from time to time, not every single sermon, but I think when it's a very, very helpful thing, then to just point that out to people. I guess people want to be, they are keen to try and read the Bible for themselves. They want to learn how. And I guess one of the things you want to do is demystify the whole process. You're not, some kind of expert. I remember Dick Lucas used to say, he's not this magician that pulls a bunny out of a hat. What he says from his sermons is just there, and it's in the text. And so I think I want to just demystify that. I didn't work this out because I'm so clever. Actually, if we pay attention, it's there.
Denesh, this first talk of yours, it finished landing on Jesus Christ. And you've talked a bit about this already, how Judges points to God's King to come. But could I just ask, why did you choose to finish your sermon on this point, that Jesus is the King who never compromised?
Yeah, I guess from a theological conviction point of view, we want to know that the whole Bible is fulfilled in Jesus. So you wouldn't want to really preach the sermons in Judges without showing how it relates to Jesus somehow. So that's, I guess, important. I guess if the whole book is trying to show us that not having a king led to chaos, then we want to kind of show positively that side of it, how having a king would help. I guess one of the things about the first sermon was if we are people that are so stuck in this compromising heart condition, then actually you could say to people, just try harder. Don't compromise, be 100% obedient Christian, but that's just not going to happen. And that's just impossible. And it'll drive people to despair. And the thing is, the book is trying to say to you that, there's no king. We do what's right in our own eyes. And the Bible story tells you, well, there is a king. He does what's right in God's eyes. He's the king that never compromises. So I think what you want to ultimately drive people to is not to look inwards on themselves, but actually to just gaze at Jesus and marvel that we do have such a king. So we want to try and direct people to him.
Denesh, your talk was really clear. It was about compromise. That's how you started. You had this fantastic long introduction about all the ways that we might compromise as a Christian. But can I just push back on you a little bit? Because, okay, well, Israel, they compromised in the sense that they went and worshipped false gods and they were involved in all sorts of evil practice. Is it really fair to draw a parallel between them and Christians like myself who sometimes don't read their Bible in the morning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess yes and no to some degree. Yes, in the sense that we are in the same fallen condition as sinners. We always want to do what's right in our own eyes rather than in God's eyes. And much of the New Testament actually calls on us to flee from sin, to put to death our sinful nature. So I think that's actually quite similar. It's really calling us to not compromise and to live as we are. So I think that's quite similar. I guess it is different in the sense that for Israel, I guess they were given quite explicit commands, especially things that they were disobeying in Judges about the nations and not having anything to do with the nations and having to wipe out the nations. I think that was quite specific to them. I guess for us, the areas of compromise are different. But also, I guess one big difference would be just that we're new covenant people. So we have new hearts. We've got the Spirit now in us. The Spirit's trying to help us to obey God and to do His will. And I think that actually maybe gives us more hope, more motivation that we can be people with the Spirit's help who increasingly live lives that are less and less compromised. So yeah, kind of yes and kind of no, I guess.
How has your understanding of what it is to compromise as a Christian developed over your Christian life?
Yeah, I think it's broadened a lot. In the early days of being a Christian, I guess I only thought about it in terms of, the big areas. Like I don't want to be worshiping idols, I want to be worshiping God, or maybe I thought about sexual purity or something like that. But I guess as I've kind of grown as a Christian, I realized, wow, actually, this idea of not compromising is an all of life thing. So, for example, Jesus calls on me to deny myself, take up the cross. So dying to myself really in every area of my life, it's really quite a high bar. Romans 12 talks about being a living sacrifice and, not conforming to the world, being transformed by the renewal of my mind. So it's again kind of an all of life kind of thing.
And that means like the big things and the small, the seen, the unseen.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all of that.
Yeah. And it's just so easy, I think, to just pat ourselves on the back with the big ones. I don't sleep around. I'm faithful to my wife, whatever. But, I'm not prayerful. I don't read the Bible. I'm not, zealously trying to reach my neighbors with the gospel. So I think we kind of really can be quite self-righteous and narrow in this area of compromise. So I think that's broadened. I think it's massively deepened my appreciation for Jesus. Just as I see how far short I fall. But I think at the same time, I just reflect on Jesus and just see that, it really was painful for him to not give in to Satan in the wilderness. I would give in a heartbeat. It was just so painful for him in the Garden of Gethsemane to, be wrestling with God. If this is really your will, is there another way? And then to think about him hanging on the cross when people just mocking him and asking him to come down from the cross. And any of us would have come down from the cross. We would have just given in there and then, but he doesn't. And so I guess on the one hand, just that broadening out this area of compromise that I really struggle with, but at the same time seeing how Jesus doesn't, that just really makes me rejoice and be thankful for him. To fall in love with him, I guess, again and again. And I guess a bit like what I said, I mean, not to be therefore, just gazing at Jesus and that's it, but actually realizing I'm a different person now. I've got a new heart, new spirit. I'm raised with Christ. I'm his son. Ephesians 5 talks about how I'm light. I'm a child of the light, and I am a different person. And therefore, by God's grace, with his help and enabling, I can live increasingly a less and less compromised life.
In terms of your talk, the 2 points you made were don't compromise, God always keeps his words, and don't compromise leads to judgment. Just on the first one, God always keeps his words. How has that truth helped you and others in your church in their walk with Jesus?
Sometimes we compromise because we just don't really trust God's word. We don't take him at his word. We don't think he's faithful. But actually, if we know that this is a God who does what he says, actually that's so liberating and actually empowering, that it gives me the confidence, the courage to take risks for God, to be able to do the difficult things, because I know that actually he has things covered. And I can really, really trust him each step of the way. So I think that was maybe a surprising thing, because the second one where don't compromise because he'll judge you. I think that's our natural default. Because we're maybe driven more by guilt and fear naturally as people. But to see that no, he's a faithful God, and therefore if he's a faithful God, you can step out, you can trust him, you can obey him, you can do the difficult things. Because this is a God that you can really, really trust as you progress, which is kind of what we see in Jesus, isn't it? I mean, that he knows God will keep his word. And therefore, I think that kind of allows him to just progress and to stick with it, even though it was very, very hard.
It's really helpful. I think, my temptation so much is to just want the easy life, I guess, which would be filled with compromise on the gospel. But, I don't make a fuss. I don't, make a scene. I don't upset anyone. I don't do anything too wild. Just kind of sail through comfortably. But actually, often for me, that would involve compromising on what the Lord has asked me to do and what the Lord has given me. But actually, I think what you just said is so helpful, that God is faithful. There's times when you don't compromise. It's not as if he doesn't see that. Actually, he is faithful to keep his words, to deliver us. And actually, yeah, those words, well done, good and faithful servant, at the end of that. It's an amazing reminder and encouragement to not compromise.
Yeah.
Dinesh, you started your talk with a range of areas that your congregation may be compromising. I remember things like relationships, the time at work, whether you're actually working hard. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Were those situations that you know that your congregation at the Crossing grapple with, are faced with every day? Can you tell us a little bit more about the context you were preaching into?
Yeah. So just take one example of that. I guess dating non-Christians. That's a pretty big area of compromise. I wouldn't say it's a big area of compromise, but it's something that people struggle with in our church, especially having lots of 20s and 30-year-olds around the place. And I think that has been made a lot worse over COVID. So I think we were doing okay on that as a church pre-COVID. And then I think with COVID, the thing that kind of erupted when we all kind of came back face to face was we realized dating apps were all the rage. And dating apps, people just meeting all sorts of people online. And yes, if they were trying to meet people online, then they did try to meet Christians. But by and large, they were just meeting nominal Christians, people who said they were Christian, but it's really quite a different thing whether you're living as a Christian, denying yourself. So I think that's been a huge area of compromise. And maybe this sounds extreme, but that's really been a graveyard of some of the Christians in our church, really. It's taken them away, taken their affections away from the Lord. And that's been a real battle. And so I think we wanted to raise some of these issues, I guess, because they are quite live issues, to help people to see that, we really need to kind of be faithful and to see that God's ways are better than our ways.
Yeah, I think graveyard isn't an overstatement. I can think of a girl recently from my area of ministry who has started dating a non-Christian, and she has just walked away. She's no longer at church. She's no longer in Bible study. And it's awful to see, and you pray on, but that is an area of compromise. I think we've also seen a similar thing over here in England over COVID, that dating apps, they were the way to socialize in lockdown, and just subtly that desire for a relationship. You think, oh, well, so long as we don't sleep together before we're married, and so long as he's approving of me going to church, that's fine. But no, you're right. He keeps his word and he will judge. It is something we want to preach to our congregations. On a slightly different note, can you tell us about pastors? What's the temptation for compromise there?
Yeah, maybe I guess two. Well, one will be, a bit of a dichotomy between our public and private persona. So in public, it's easy to kind of preach one thing about not compromising, about being gung-ho and zealous for the Lord. But then privately, are we really that way? Do our priorities as a family really reflect that? Are we as obsessed as every other family in Singapore about our child's education and getting ahead? Or are we, really more concerned with the fact that they're living for the Lord, that we're prayerful, we're looking at His word and trying to be directed by that? So I think that would be a big area of compromise, where publicly you're one thing and then privately at home you're quite another, and no one really knows. I guess in Singapore, there's a lot of pressure because it's multicultural, multi-religious. There's a lot of pressure to not upset the religious harmony in the country, to not speak about other religions, for example. So one big area of compromise is that lots of pastors, I think, would shy away from preaching the gospel, meaning they wouldn't really be preaching Jesus the only way, wouldn't really be preaching hell. You just preach, maybe some of the character attributes of Jesus. Maybe you preach all the nice bits about the gospel, but you don't really try and show the difference between the grace of Jesus versus what else is on offer out there. And I think also that churches increasingly we see are involved in good works, charitable works, rather than preaching the good news, which is a huge area of compromise, because you're really kind of deviating from holding out the gospel to this lost world.
So it's almost just preaching the nice bits of the gospel that don't offend anyone, else, particularly other kind of religious.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Because I guess when we think of compromise, we think of, well, like, in some ways being a Christian on Sunday, but actually, I don't know, being a total rogue the rest of the week. But actually, you're saying even in the way we preach and what we choose to preach, actually, even there, it is possible to compromise as well. Denesh, if you could preach this passage again, is there anything you would change?
Yeah, great question. Our first order of business at staff meeting every Monday is sermon feedback. And so,
as in like 24 hours after the sermon's preached.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah. And at the moment, I mean, it might change. At the moment, we get 2 trainees to give feedback. So I think we're just trying to level the playing field and help them to know that they can speak up and they can help us, even though we might be the pastor or whatever.
That's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, they say a few things about what's positive, what could be improved, and then what they personally took away from the sermon. I guess if I could go back and redo this sermon, I mean, I wondered about whether I really needed to look at this second example of compromise in the text, this man from Bethel, and how they treated this man from Bethel in chapter 1, verse 22 to 26. Maybe the point about them not driving out the people and forced labor. I think that I made the point about compromise already. And I think if I had maybe not gone to the man in Bethel, that time perhaps could have developed. I could have used that to develop the application a little bit more. In particular, I think what we said already about God's faithfulness as a motivation to not compromise. I think perhaps I could have developed that a little bit more. And maybe another thing is I could have gone back to a few of the examples of compromise I mentioned at the start and maybe tease them out more. So maybe it was, maybe the dating example or something, and to just say, okay, if that's you, actually, how is what we've heard today, how's that going to help you to not compromise and to battle in this area? So I think that would have probably been helpful to do and could have just grounded the application, made it more real. So maybe that could be something for version 2.
Well, it was a really fantastic talk nonetheless, and we're so grateful for you coming today to speak to us. And I'm really pleased that you'll be back again for the next episodes to talk to us about another passage you preached on, chapter 6 in Judges. So Denesh, we're really looking forward to speaking to you then. But for now, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts and wisdom on the book of Judges.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bible Matters podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not like and subscribe on whatever platform you get your podcasts? The Bible Matters project is funded entirely by the generous gifts of our listeners. And if you yourself would like to become a financial partner with us, you can find more details on how to give in the show notes. The Bible Matters podcast is an initiative of St. Helens Bishopsgate and is created by myself, Tiff Stromso, along with Leo Elborn. Music for this episode was written and produced by Leo Elborn and Josh Stidwell. You can listen to more of Josh's work at Stids with a 1, that is ST1DS. Thanks again for joining, and we hope to see you again soon.